Right, everyone okay? How um how did we feel like the quiz went this morning? Okay, I'm seeing some different opinions about that. Listen, let me reiterate what the purpose of these quizzes are. The purpose of these quizzes are to give you practice for the exam, right? And so, I kind of expect at times you to struggle on these quizzes. In fact, because, they're a good practice. They're a great way to figure out maybe what you thought you knew, but then maybe you don't know as well as you thought, right? And so the most important thing that can come out of these quizzes for you is to identify areas where maybe you need to go back and pay a little bit more attention to, right? Because if you miss it on the quiz, but you get it right on the exam, you're going to do just fine in this class, right? So we have a lot of quizzes, 5 quizzes. They're relatively small number of points, right? So this is really just kind of an opportunity. Not a lot is at stake for these quizzes. So I'm certainly not telling you that you should be happy if you don't do very well, but I also think you don't want to panic, but you want to use these quizzes as a learning opportunity, right? That's really how I view these quizzes. And so, yeah, they're worth a little bit of points, but the primary thing is to give you some feedback on how well you're getting what I think to be important concepts. So I will be looking at your quizzes. I've looked at a couple of them, but I'll be looking at them this afternoon, and then I will give them back to you tomorrow morning. For those of you who are in class in person, I'll give them back to you in person. For those of you who are online, I'll probably send them back to you tonight. And so tomorrow morning, we will go over the quizzes as a group. Okay. So we will talk about what the answers were. You'll have an opportunity to ask any questions that you might have about them, and we'll go from there. Okay, so that will be the first quiz. We'll talk about it tomorrow, and then remember, your second quiz is going to be on Thursday. And so tomorrow we'll talk about your second quiz. What's going to be on that? That's mainly going to be on comparative advantage and GDP and inflation, what we talked about today and tomorrow. So that's where we're going on Thursday. Okay, so remember that our routine here of having quizzes or exams every Tuesday or Thursday, at least for the first 3 weeks. So, okay, well, what are we going to talk about this afternoon? I'm not going to have an extremely long class this afternoon. We had a long class yesterday afternoon, and sometimes it's a little hard to have afternoon class. At least for me, I'm probably more of a morning person than an afternoon person. So we'll kind of try to be efficient here, but we won't go. I don't think we'll go all the way to 2 o'clock, and maybe we'll be finished closer to 1:30 here today. So I want to talk a little bit more about GDP, all right? And so let's just go back and kind of pick up a little bit where we left this morning. Okay, so if you remember, we talked about GDP as really measuring 3 things at one time. It's a measure of aggregate income, it's a measure of aggregate output, and it's a measure of aggregate expenditure, right? And all of these things are equal in an economy because, all of these things have to equal each other because there's no leakage, right? There's no way for income not to be equal to expenditure because all expenditure has to come from somebody's income. Then we define GDP as the market value of all final goods and services produced within a country's borders over a period of time. Okay, so key words here being final goods and services, right? So we don't want to include intermediate goods within a country's borders, meaning that nationality doesn't matter. Anything that's produced on U.S. soil is included in GDP. But the key word is produced, right? Because that's really the focus of GDP. It's focused on production, right? So that is something has to be produced. And if something's not produced, right, if it's just a transaction in which money goes from one person to the other, it's not going to be included in GDP. So if going back here for a moment, remember we said that GDP measures 3 things at one time. So there's actually, when you think about the components of GDP, GDP can be broken into smaller categories. Just to give you some idea, GDP this year is about $21 trillion in 2020. That is a big chunk of money, okay? $21 trillion, that is a lot of money. And so oftentimes we find it more useful to think about breaking GDP down into smaller categories. And you won't be surprised to know that you can actually break down GDP based on the three things that it measures. You can be broken in based on what we call the income method. And this is when you break GDP down based on how income is earned. For example, how much is earned through wages or interest or capital gains, okay? I'm not really going to say much about this because we won't, for this class, we won't find this particularly useful, right? We really won't have much of a use to talk about breaking GDP down into the income method. And so I want you to be aware that you can break down GDP based on how income is earned, but that's not as useful for us. A second way is you can break it down based on the output method. Where you can break down total output based on industry by industry, right? How much of GDP is from cars? How much of it is from toilet paper? How much of it is from hummus, right? And so the US government collects a lot of detailed information on this, where you can break down GDP based on big picture things like services and manufacturing, or you can break it down into any smaller number of different industries, okay? We're also not going to find this method particularly useful in macroeconomics. But the third method is the one that we will use and refer to quite a bit, and this is the expenditure method. Meaning we're going to break GDP down by spending. And so this is the one that we're going to find the most useful in this class, is to break GDP down based on spending. And so when we talk about the expenditure method, we can capture it with the following equation. Y is equal to C plus I plus G plus X minus M. Okay. You notice here, instead of equal, having two dashes for an equal sign, I have three. What does that mean? This means it's true by definition. It's true by the way that we define these variables, that Y has to equal C plus I plus G plus X minus M. Okay, what do each of these symbols represent? Y is GDP, total gross domestic product. So whenever I use capital Y, I'm always talking about GDP in this class, right? We will have the convention, whenever there's a capital Y, that's representing GDP. Okay? C. C is consumption goods. Okay? Consumption goods. consumption goods are the biggest part of GDP. This is about 70% of US GDP is in consumption goods. So most of what you or I buy are consumption goods. And you can break this into smaller categories. This is goods that are durables and non-durables. You can think about services versus goods. I'm going to show you a breakdown of GDP here in a minute, and you can see that you can draw this into very fine distinctions, right? You can break this down all the way down to, how much do people spend on food? How much do they spend on gas? How much do they spend on automobiles? How much they spend on airplane tickets, right? I mean, you can break it down to that level if you're interested in. But C overall is the biggest part of GDP, right? About 70% of GDP is consumption goods. I is probably the hardest one to figure out in some ways. In part because when economists talk about investment, we mean something very specific, a little bit different than how we usually use the word investment in our typical everyday usage. Okay, what is investment? Investment is largely three things. Well, actually, I'm going to say four things. It is physical capital, right? In other words, when I'm talking about investment, I'm typically talking about the things that firms purchase, typically. Not always, but typically the things that firms purchase. So physical capital like factories, equipment, machinery, okay? Inventories are part of investment. So you might say, can a banana be an investment good? Yeah, strangely enough, a banana can be an investment good if it's in your inventory, right? So if I'm a grocery, as long as that banana is sitting in my inventory, it's actually technically part of my investment, right? Intellectual property spending, like research and development, is an increasingly big part of investment. Okay, so you think about a company like Merck, right? One of the companies that's produced the COVID vaccine. The money that they spent last year producing that COVID vaccine is a form of investment for them, right? It's a form of investment for them. There's only one good that a typical household would buy that would show up in investment. Anybody have any guesses? What's the one thing that you and I might buy that might show up in investment?
A house?
A house, yeah. But the key here is it's got to be a new house, right? New housing. Because if it's an old house, remember, then that doesn't get included in GDP at all, right? That doesn't get included in GDP at all. But if it's a new house, then yes, it gets included in GDP, right? So these are the four big things that show up in investment. So here's a source of confusion. Oftentimes when people, when you and I talk in everyday usage, we talk about, well, I'm going to invest in the stock market, or I've got a lot of investments in the stock market. That's not really what economists consider investment, right? Playing the stock market, buying stocks is not investment. Investment is really the purchase of firms, capital, right? Whether it's physical capital or intellectual capital, and then new housing, right? That's what we mean by investment. So don't be confused by that, because here economists have a very specific definition of investment, while kind of in everyday usage, we use investment very, very broadly. G is government purchases. Okay, these are the things that government purchases that are included in GDP. This is largely military spending, public investment, such as roads, bridges, education spending, and other government services. Okay, that's what's included in government purchases. These are the things that the government buys. Now, very importantly, government purchases is not the same thing as government spending. What's the difference? What's the difference here?
Can like government spending not necessarily, like can government spending, like a government can spend money on private things, right? So it's not technically like a government service, if that makes sense, just because, but it might still have money coming from the government.
I'm not sure I'm quite understanding you, Jesse.
Like, can't private entities receive government money, but that's not a government service, if that makes sense? Like it's a private service, it's just they happen to have money coming from the government. Is that like how that would be a difference? Because it's government spending, but it's not a government service.
Um, yeah, right. Okay, so I think I understand what you're saying. Listen, the government does a lot of spending that is not involved in production, and so does not get included in GDP. I think that's what you're saying, Jesse. Specifically, the difference here is government transfer payments. A lot of what the government does is transfer money from one person to another person, but it doesn't involve any production. This is things like Social Security, welfare.
Stimuluses?
The stimulus is a good example, right? Those $600 checks are not included in GDP. So they'd be part of government spending, but they are not part of government purchases because they're not part of GDP. Unemployment benefits. Okay, there's a lot of what the government spends on that's not included in GDP. In fact, we'll talk about this a little bit later when we actually talk about the government budget in more detail. But nowadays, about half of government spending is just transfer payments, right? About half of government spending is just transfer payments. So in other words, it's just taking money from one group of people and giving it to another group of people. It's not actually involved in production. Okay, the final is, I'll put these together, X minus M, which is often referred to as net exports, or you can also call it the trade balance, where X is equal to exports and M is equal to imports. Why do we add exports in here, right? When we look at the equation, why are exports added in?
Because they were produced in this country.
They were produced in this country, but they were sold abroad, right? So we don't include exports, we're missing a lot of what's produced here. Yeah, exactly, Ruthie. Now, why are imports subtracted? Well, really,
Because they were produced outside of the country.
yes, right? It's produced outside of the country, but it was consumed here. Okay, so think about an example. Let's say that I went and I bought $100 bottle of French wine. That will never happen, by the way, but just say I bought $100 bottle of French wine. So where does that get included? That actually gets included in consumption. But we don't want it to impact GDP. So what do? We subtract it out at the end. So what's the net effect on GDP? Zero. Right? So really imports are the way that we subtract out all these consumption and investment in government purchases goods that weren't made here in the US. Right? So that's why we have exports and imports. What's true for the US about the balance between these two? Which one's bigger?
Imports.
Imports, right? In other words, if we look at our net exports or our trade balance, it's negative, right? The imports are greater than exports.
Professor.
Yeah.
Clarify, is it X is net exports and M is trade balance?
No, X is exports and M is imports.
Oh, I see it now. Sorry.
The difference between the two, right? The difference between the two is what we call net exports or the trade balance.
Okay.
And likewise, what happens, sometimes you can see it written like this. This we would call the trade deficit, right? So a trade deficit is essentially the negative of net exports. That makes sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so so you can see here. Oh, dang it. Let's try this screen share again. Sorry, I'll find what I want to show you here. So this is actually looking, you can ignore the first column and just look at the second column, all right? So this is looking at government spending. I think this is in 2017. So government spending was about $20 trillion. You can see that G is about 17.7%, I is about 16.4%, and C is about 70%. And then what is net exports? It's actually negative 2.7%, right? So in other words, our trade deficit is about 2.7% of total GDP. So that kind of helps you kind of visualize what's going on here with GDP. Maybe it helps, right? Maybe it helps. So most of government spending most of GDP is C. And then investment in government purchases are roughly about the same. And then we have to make this correction for the fact that we run a pretty consistently, at least since 1980 or so, have pretty consistently run a trade deficit. And we'll talk about why that is here a little bit later in class. Let's just look at the most recent GDP data. Okay. So can you all see this? It says at the top, table 3, gross domestic product, level and change from preceding period. Let's see that? Okay. So let's just look at the first column. First column, gross domestic product in 2020. Okay, so this is the most recent data that the US government has from on GDP. And we see that the gross domestic product is about 20,932 billion, or just a little bit less than $21 trillion, right? Just a little bit less than 21 trillion. Of that, you can see in line 2, we have personal consumption expenditures, which is C. And C is about $14 trillion. And then if you look under that, you can see how it can be broken down into smaller categories where we have goods, non-durable goods, motor vehicles, furnishings. We have services, right? Different types of services in terms of healthcare, et cetera, right? So, that basically line 1 through line 25 is all parts of C. And then we have, beginning in line 26, we have gross private domestic investment, or in other words, I. And I is about $3.6 trillion, which includes fixed investment, right? And fixed investment can be non-residential or industrial equipment. There's intellectual property products in here. You can see that there's change in line 40, there's change in private inventories, all right? So these are all the different components of I. Then we look at here, they have this a little bit different order. They have X minus M before G, right? But in X minus M, you can see what our exports were about 2.1 trillion. Our imports were about 2.7 trillion. Of that, they divided into goods and services. And then finally, you have G, right? And G is spending at the federal level, spending at the state and local level, and you can see how much of this spending at, for instance, at the federal level goes into national defense versus non-defense, all right? So, the reason to show you this is just to say that you can really break GDP down into a lot of smaller categories to get a much more detailed look at what's happening in the economy. For our purposes, though, we will spend a lot of time talking about Y is equal to C plus I plus G, right? Because I think there's a number of reasons why we want to think about the different components of GDP, but very importantly, the different components of GDP behave in different ways over time. And so looking at how these different components change helps us understand a lot of what's going on in the economy, all right? And so I think that will be a little bit clear as we kind of go along. But we will definitely refer to our magic Y equals C plus I plus G equation many, many times. Okay, let's talk now a little bit about how do we actually calculate GDP. Do a couple of examples. And while we do this, spend some time talking about the distinction between what we're going to call nominal GDP and what we call real GDP. Okay, so before I define what real and nominal GDP are, let's just do a simple example here. So let's say that you're crazy enough to become an economist, and you're going to be an anthropological economist. You're going to go to a country, and you're going to do some research and try to capture this country's GDP. So you find this magical island, right? Called Party Island. And you find that on this magical island, they only have two goods, beer and Doritos. That's all they do, is produce beer and Doritos and eat beer and Doritos, all right? And so you go in 2019 and you collect some data. And so what do you find? You find that Doritos cost $1. And that the island, Party Island, made 500 units of Doritos. And then you go to the market and you find that beer was $2 or to whatever their currency is. and they made 600 units of beer. Okay. What is nominal GDP in 2019? Without defining nominal yet, what is GDP? Who's got an idea?
Their production, like what they produce and sell. So would that be like 1 times 500 and then 2 times 600 to get the total amount of revenue they can create?
Exactly. So you remember that definition of GDP. It's just the market value of all goods and services produced within a country over a period of time, right? So what's the market value of Doritos? 500. What's the market value of beer? That. You add it all together, nominal GDP is 1,700. That's GDP. What does the word nominal mean? Nominal means measured in current prices. And this is a term that we are going to use a lot. Nominal means measured in current prices, or to put it another way, and we'll see why this is important in a minute, it is not adjusted for inflation. So when we talk about nominal data, we are saying that data is not adjusted for inflation. All right. So that's calculating nominal GDP. Really, nominal GDP is just that simple, right? It's just that simple. In the US economy, of course, it's more complicated because instead of having 2 goods, you have hundreds and hundreds of thousands of goods, millions of goods, and you have lots of different prices. But in theory, it's just that simple. You find the market value of everything produced and then you add it up, right? That gives you nominal GDP. Now, let's say that you go back, you first went to Party Island in 2019. Now you go back in 2020 and you do the same experiment, right? Or you collect the same data. And what you find is it hasn't been a great year on Party Island. Prices went up, right? The price of Doritos was $1, now it's $2. And before they were making 500 units of Doritos, now they're only making 400. Right? Sad times on Party Island. And much the same story is true about beer. Beer was $2, now the price has gone up to $3. And before they made 600 units, now they're only making 500 units. Right? Very sad. What is nominal GDP in 2020? Well, it's 2 times 400 plus 3 times 500 . 2,300. Wait a second, what happened? What's our nominal GDP telling us? If we just looked at nominal GDP alone, it was 1,700. Now it's 2,300. If we just looked at nominal GDP, it's actually telling us that Party Island is better off. But is it? No, we know it's not better off. We know that they're producing less Doritos and less beer, but yet we found that we have a higher rate of nominal GDP. In fact, we can figure out what nominal GDP growth was between 2019 and 2020 by taking the percent change, right? So we could take GDP in 2020 minus GDP in 2019, divide by GDP in 2019. Remember, you always begin by the initial year or the old year, right? And you multiply that by 100. As you have a calculator, you can figure this out, that this is 35.3%. The growth between 2019 and 2020 looks astonishing, right? It looks like they should be way better off, but we know that they're not. What's the problem here? What are we missing? Why is nominal GDP making it look like this country's better off when in fact we know that they can't be?
Well, the prices escalated, so I guess the idea of GDP is coming from that increase in price, but they're actually producing less.
Right. The problem is inflation. Inflation distorts nominal values. You can't just compare one price at one point in time with a price at another point in time and expect to have an accurate comparison. Okay? This is something we will harp on a lot in this class. And in fact, maybe this is one of the most important things that you can learn from an economics class, is the difference between what we're going to call nominal variables and what we call real variables. As we said above, nominal means measured in current prices. And not adjusted for inflation. Because it's not adjusted for inflation, nominal data can give you misleading pictures of how the world works, right? It can be misleading. In some cases, purposely so. In some cases, people will use nominal data to purposefully mislead you in ways that we'll talk about. So what do you do about that? What we need to do is we need to find variables that are what we call real variables. And real variables means that they're measured in constant prices. And as a result, they're adjusted for inflation. So if we're talking about comparing dollars over time, is the only accurate way. I did not write, this is not the most cohesive sentence I've ever written in this class. Comparing real values is the only accurate way to compare data over time, right? If I'm looking at data over time, I really need to think about real values and not nominal values. In other words, I have to adjust for differences in price. So you guys probably all have your grandma, right? When my grandma was alive, whenever I saw her, she loved to tell me, well, back in my day, I could get gas for 25 cents a gallon. And she acted like gas was so expensive today because it was only 25 cents a gallon. But of course, that doesn't make any sense. You can't compare a price back in 1940 to a price today because we know the price level has changed, right? So you just can't compare nominal values over time and expect to be able to make any sort of reasonable comparison. What we need to do is we need to look at real data. Real data means it's measured in constant prices. How do we do that? Well, in the case of real GDP, we calculate it by using a constant set of prices. Using a constant set of prices year to year, and what we're going to call the base year. Okay, so let's redo our example. Let's make 2019 the base year. In other words, the year that we're going to use constant set of prices. And now let's calculate what real GDP is.
Professor,
Yes.
can you scroll up when you're done with that?
Yeah,
Yeah, right there's good.
just leave it there for a second.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So how do we
Yeah.
calculate real GDP in 2019? We use base year prices times 2019 quantity. Of course, what is the base year? It's 2019. So what's the answer we're going to get for real GDP in 2019? It's the same as we had before. In other words, nominal GDP equals real GDP in the base year. Because you're using the same set of prices, right? In the base year, there's no difference between nominal GDP and real GDP. Where there's going to be a difference is when we calculate real GDP in 2020. Where we use base year prices times 2020 quantity. So what is this? If I can flip up to our data. What's our base year prices? $1 and $2, right? $1 for Doritos and $2 for beer. But then what do we want to use? We want to use 2020 quantities. So this becomes $1 times 400, the price in the base year times the quantity in 2020, which is 400, plus $2 times the quantity of beer, which is 500, what's the answer we get now? $1,400. What was nominal GDP? $2,300. So notice we're getting a much, much lower figure when we adjust for inflation. And what's real GDP growth between 1990 or between 1919 and between 2019 and 2020? Well, it's GDP in 2020 minus real GDP in 2019 divided by real GDP in 2019 times 100. This gives us negative 17.6%. So when we compare real GDP across time, we're getting a much more accurate picture of what's going on. This has not been a good period of time for Party Island, right? So whenever we compare dollar figures across time, we have to use real data, not nominal data. That is an absolutely crucial idea from this class. And it is quite honestly the way that a lot of people lie to you, right? Because a lot of people, whether it's politicians or whether it's somebody who serves some other interest, is trying to lie to you by not giving you real data. They give you nominal data. Let me just give you one example of this. This doesn't happen as much during our COVID era, but you know, if for those of you who like to watch movies, you'll see, well, the new X-Men movie came out, the biggest selling movie of all time. Well, is it? I mean, of course it's going to gross more, but that's because ticket prices are a lot higher now than they were last year or 10 years ago or 50 years ago. In fact, if you look at real revenue, what's the highest grossing movie of all time? Gone with the Wind, right? Not in nominal terms, because in nominal terms, ticket prices were, 10 cents. But in real terms, right, meaning adjusted for differences in prices, Gone with the Wind made a lot more money than any of these superhero movies. You have to compare real values over time. If not, you're not making an accurate comparison. And that is certainly true for real GDP, right? That's certainly true for real GDP. So, when you look at GDP data, right? Here's just some real GDP data from 2003 and 2009 and 2015. And so for the first column, you just see what nominal GDP is for these years, right? Measured in current prices. So in other words, in nominal GDP in 2003, we use 2003 prices times 2003 quantity. In 2009, we used 2009 prices. In 2015, we used 2015 prices. But you can't really compare those nominal GDP figures across times, right? Because you're not controlling for inflation. A much better way to compare across time is to look at real GDP. So here, they've calculated real GDP, but they're using 2009 as the base year. And notice when you make 2009 the base year, you're making 2003 look a lot better and 2015 look worse, right? Because you're using 2009 prices are higher than 2003 prices, but they're lower than 2015 prices. But once you've adjusted and put these dollar figures in real terms, now you can make a more accurate comparison as to what's happened over these periods of time. Okay? So that is an idea that we will come back to again and again and again and again in this class, right? Is that you need to talk about real values, right? Real values, if you're going to be able to understand what's going on across time, right? Let's just talk about one last thing here, real GDP, before before I let you go. This is less technical, but more of a kind of big picture. does GDP really measure well-being? In other words, when GDP goes up, are we really better off? That's a legitimate question. That is a legitimate question to ask. Does GDP really capture whether we're better off? If GDP goes up by 5 or 2%, does that mean we're 2% better than we were, right? So, oftentimes economists are criticized somewhat accurately that we are obsessed with GDP, and that we just think that, yeah, if it increases GDP, it's got to be good, and if it decreases GDP, that it's got to be bad. And so let's kind of talk about that, because GDP actually does have a number of limitations. There are some real problems with using GDP as a measure of well-being. And so let's kind of talk about these. One of the biggest problems with GDP is that it ignores income inequality. This is going to be a topic of discussion for us later in the class. But one of the things that we cannot do is say, well, if income goes up by 2%, we are all 2% better off. In fact, that is decidedly not the case. And increasingly, it's not the case. Increasingly, we are seeing in the US and in other countries a growing problem of income inequality, where most of the gains in GDP are going to a small number of people. We will talk about a lot of facts later related to income inequality, but let me just give you one fact. In the US, the top 1%, these are the people who earn more than $230,000 a year. Earn 50% of GDP. 50% of GDP goes to the top 1% of Americans. This is people earning more than $230,000 a year. Okay? So that is a huge problem. As I said, we're going to come back and talk about this in a lot more detail in a week or so. But this is an increasing problem in the US, that when you talk about gains in GDP, it's largely going to a small fragment of the population. And so what does this mean about the other 99%? Well, largely stuck with stagnant incomes, particularly the bottom 90%, right, have largely had stagnant incomes. And so this is one reason to think that if GDP goes up, it doesn't necessarily mean that we're all doing better. It means some people are doing better, but it doesn't mean all of us are doing better, right? And so that is a significant weakness with GDP, and something you got to keep in mind. Here's another problem with GDP. It ignores what economists call externalities. An externality is when there's a cost or benefit that are incurred by people other than the buyer and seller. Right? When there's costs or benefits that are incurred by people other than the buyer or seller. The classic example of this is pollution. So let's say that I start a hog lot in Iowa, and I raise hogs and sell them. But what do I do with all the pig shit? I just kind of let it run into the river. And so it goes into the river and just goes downstream and pollutes everybody's water downstream. Are the costs of that pollution included in GDP? No. What gets included in GDP? The price of the pigs that I sell, right? Basically, or actually to be more specific, the price of the products that come from those pigs, right? The meat or other things that might be coming from the pigs, right? But not included in GDP is all of the costs of pollution. And so one legitimate criticism of GDP is that it ignores a lot of costs, right? Or resource depletion. What's the value? How does the forest contribute to GDP? Well, if the forest is just sitting there, it doesn't. But if I go and cut it down, then it will. But of course, that doesn't incorporate the costs of depleting that resource, right? These are what you can call negative externalities. But there's a lot of things that have positive externalities, such as education. Having a more highly educated population creates a lot of positive externalities. In other words, being around more highly educated people makes me more productive, makes me happier, right? Why? They're better citizens, they're better neighbors, right? And so these kind of positive externalities also don't get included in GDP. So what gets included in GDP? Well, the value of your tuition, right? But you can argue that going to college is a lot more valuable than just the tuition you pay, right? It's a lot more valuable than just the tuition you pay. And GDP ignores that stuff. GDP ignores all sorts of household production. So the increase in women entering the labor force since 1950 has increased GDP, because what used to be true? Well, women who stayed at home and raised their kids and took care of the house, the value of their work was not included in GDP. Only when they entered the labor force is their work included in GDP. You may say, well, that's not really fair because their work was valuable before they were in the labor force. That's true, but GDP doesn't include it, right? Strangely enough, women entering the labor force has increased GDP in many ways. It's by women entering the labor force, not only is their work included in GDP, but now households are much more likely to pay for things like daycare, right? And when you pay for daycare, that gets included in GDP. Right? So there's a lot of ways where household production that has moved to the formal sector has increased GDP. This is one reason why in poorer countries, a lot of GDP gets missed. Because what you see is a lot of the work that people do tends to be what we would call household production, meaning you stay at home and watch your kids, you have a garden, you might do kind of like work for your neighbors, you might barter, right? You help me with this, I'll help you with that. All those kind of informal production, they don't get included in GDP. GDP ignores underground economy. Any sort of transaction that's under the table. Right? So you have your neighbor kid come over and mow your lawn, and you give him 20 bucks and you don't declare it on your taxes. Well, that's not going to get included in GDP, right? Any sort of illegal activity is most likely not getting accounted in GDP. Any guesses? Economists have actually gone out and estimated this. How much of the US economy is devoted to illegal activity?
40%.
40%. Max, you are one cynical dude. Well, yeah, no, that's way too high for the US. In the US, about 5% is in illegal activity. What about Italy? Max?
25%.
So you missed, you overcorrected,
Ooh.
5%, right? So yeah, right there, there's a problem. There's a problem with GDP in certain countries. When you have a lot of illegal activity, things are getting missed, right? In fact, I'll share with you this article. This is from The Economist magazine that said that because Italy misses so much, they've actually started to include things like prostitution in GDP.
Are you showing us an infographic?
Are you seeing the one that says sex, drugs, and GDP?
No, I see send or receive feedback easily.
All right, something screwy went on here. Let's see this.
All right, now we see it.
Now you're seeing? Okay. Yeah, so here's just an article from The Economist. We don't have to read it, but just goes to show so much of Italy's GDP is in illegal activity that they've actually begun to estimate it and begin to count some illegal activities such as drugs and prostitution in GDP. So, you know, once again, for some economies, traditional ways of measuring GDP ignores a lot, right? It ignores a lot. Okay, one last thing here. And, you know, obviously there's a lot that we could talk about. Many of people have said one problem with GDP is that it essentially ignores leisure. That it treats leisure as having zero value. So for instance, the US has higher per capita GDP, right? When I talk about per capita GDP, I'm just talking about GDP divided by the population. So the US has higher per capita the US has higher per capita GDP than Europe. But largely based on one fact: Americans work more than Europeans, right? We work more. We work more hours. As we work, that adds to our GDP. Europeans tend to buy less stuff, but prefer to have more leisure. Well, you know, once again, who's to say that Europeans are worse off from that, right? They might actually be better off from that. And so the fact that GDP really doesn't make any accounting for leisure, once again, you know, means that there's some real problems, right? So you might have got to this point in my discussion and just say, it'd be like, well, God, with all these problems with GDP, why the hell are we bothering with it, right? If there's so many problems, why do we bother with it? And the reason is because GDP is imperfect. but it is highly correlated with every reasonable measure of well-being. So in other words, we could think about different measures of well-being. And one of the things we're going to see is that GDP is correlated with it. So let me give you an example. Life expectancy. You might say, well, isn't life expectancy a better measure of how well a country's doing? Yeah, it might be, but what do we see? GDP is highly correlated with life expectancy, right? You can look at other measures of public health. You'll find the same thing. Literacy, right? We could go on and on and on and on picking things. There's even, you know, basically happiness surveys where you go across countries and you just ask people how happy you are. In fact, let me show you one example of this. Okay. Here's just a survey done across countries in which the percent of the population that reports being thriving, their well-being is thriving. And we graph that against GDP per capita. What do we see? Well, the relationship's not perfect, but once again, richer countries tend to report being happier, right? And there's actually a lot of data on this, right? There's lots of different surveys that have essentially come to the same conclusion. So GDP is not perfect, right? GDP is not perfect, but it is correlated with pretty much any measure of well-being that you can use. And so as a result, that's why we use it, right? That's why we use it. And so when we talk about income or aggregate output, or when we just talk about progress, economic development, GDP is usually the one statistic that economists tend to turn to. Not to say that the other statistics aren't useful and can't also provide us useful information, but if we're going to turn to one, we usually turn GDP, right? Even with all of its flaws, right? Even with all of its flaws, it can still tell us a lot about how well countries are doing. Okay, well, we actually accomplished quite a bit today. And so what we're going to do tomorrow morning is we will pick up in chapter 7 and begin to talk about inflation and GDP, right? So we'll do some of that. And then time permitting, we might also begin to get into chapter 8, which is about unemployment and GDP, all right? So that will be kind of the agenda for tomorrow. Other than that, no quiz. So that's the good news. All right, well, thanks for everything today, folks. I'll be sending you an email with the agenda and with the links to today's lecture here in a few minutes, okay? All right, have a good evening.